In this city, every borough, every bridge, every block has a story to tell.
So much music came out of that little neighborhood. The Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Strokes, Lady Gaga, Norah Jones.
Stories that are told in riffs and rhymes and beats. From its garages, punk screamed.
When I would go out to the CBGB's, Joey Ramone was always there.
On its streets, hip-hop was born.
They popped off the ASAP legacy.
And a legend was silenced.
Same young man who has gotten his autograph pulls out a pistol and unloads 5 rounds into John Lennon's back.
From Studio 54 to the Chelsea Hotel, music is all around us. You just have to know where to look. This is New York City, and music happens here. Whistling off these shores, out across the Hudson, echo the sounds of eras both past and present. Rock, salsa, jazz, hip-hop. On 8th Avenue, in a swanky neighborhood near Columbus Circle, there's a high-rise that would serve as an unlikely launch pad for a group of up-and-comers from Harlem, unafraid to challenge the conventions of hip-hop.
ASAP's a lifestyle. Stands for always strive, always prosper. Acronyms symbolizing any purpose to life.
We're not just rappers, we're artists. You represented the kids that was different coming out of the neighborhood. We was into fashion and art, and it wasn't cool to be into fashion and art.
The ASAP Mob is now one of the most successful hip-hop collectives in the game, thanks largely to the foresight of one of its members, the first to score a record deal.
It was like wise for me to take discretionary funds, try to invest it back into ASAP. So I figured, okay, we need a hub. The hardest part is, transportation, getting to each other. I just copped a crib. It was a 2-bedroom apartment with 11 tenants.
The Stash House was a hub for the ASAP Mob. A lot of us didn't have homes to go back home to. It was a brotherhood. It was our frat house.
In the Stash House, we had ASAP Ant,
ASAP Toby, ASAP Barry, ASAP Rocky, ASAP Ferg.
We got ASAP Ty.
You had Yams, you had ASAP Ills, ASAP Nasty.
The ASAP Mob was moving on up to a deluxe apartment just off Central Park, in one of Manhattan's ritziest zip codes.
It was one of the fanciest buildings we lived in at that moment, you know what I'm saying? We coming from the projects, we coming from the hood. We treated it like it was Motel 6. It'll be 5 people on a pull-out couch.
Mostly all the people in the building were quite older, right? So us young kids just coming in, renting this unit out and all this traffic didn't sit too well with those folks.
Everybody in that building was a millionaire, and they just wanted us out of there.
They accused us of killing the guy beneath us with the weed smoke and loud music. They said we stressed them. At the time, we were working on Live Love ASAP, the mixtape. That's what made it so epic. There was so much popping off, so much creativity.
ASAP Rocky released Live Love ASAP, the mixtape, for free on October 31st, 2011, to critical acclaim. But Rocky wasn't the only member of the mob perfecting his craft in that high-rise near the Circle.
We had a microphone set up in the living room so we could plan and make music, you know, freestyles and things like that. We called them Stash House freestyles. I was hungry. I had, you know, quit my job. My lifeline was music. How could I make my mark in ASAP and bring something to the table? I kind of studied Rocky and what he was doing. Yams texted me. He was like, yo, you getting signed. The ball is in my court now. I gotta, you know, take the ball and run with it.
Give me that money, give me that money.
As members of the mob began to take off, they left the Stash House. But it's a time and a place they'll never forget.
Without that time in the Stash House, I don't think we would be as close as we are, you know what I'm saying? It really prepared us for this game.
The fact that we knew we all had a mission, we all knew what we wanted to do, we all had a hub, we all had a safe haven to do that, that's what made the Stash House so perfect.
In the early 60s, the intersection of 125th and Lexington in Harlem would serve as inspiration for a song whose gritty lyrics captured the raw underbelly of New York City life.
Lou introduced me to some of the songs he'd written. They really talked about personality deficiencies. It's really about someone who's very unhappy with their own life.
Lou was Lou Reed, and the song he played for John Cale, his partner in music, back in 1964, was called I'm Waiting for the Man.
The song is about picking up drugs from your dealer on a street corner.
The street corner that inspired Lou Reed was one that he and John knew well. The two spent hours busking in the heart of Harlem at what was then the epicenter of jazz. But Lou and John were attracting interest from a different set, the counterculture art world.
That's where there were music lovers that went there for one particular thing to hear music. And if they found something strange and wonderful, like somebody singing about heroin, that might get the attention that we needed.
Lou and John were eventually joined by guitarist Sterling Morrison and drummer Mo Tucker. Now a four-piece, the group needed a name, and it would come from an unlikely source.
As a teenager, my grandfather, who was a New York artist, had this paperback book that was about Victorian sex societies in the 1800s called The Velvet Underground. And he handed the book to the manager and said, "No, maybe there's something in here."
Lou said, "How's this for the title?" And we all went crazy.
That's family lore for me, whether it's true or not.
The Velvet Underground's close ties to the art world and distinct gritty street style soon caught the attention of the star of New York's emerging pop art scene, an enigmatic figure named Andy Warhol.
Andy showed up and we had a brother in arms.
When he saw them, that was it. He didn't just like them, he really liked them.
Andy was the visionary. Whenever we needed ideas, it was always Andy that we went to. That was great support, because you never get the answer you expected. And then the bombshell, he introduced Nico to Lou, and then things changed radically.
Nico, a singer from Germany, was one of Warhol's superstar muses.
What Nico brought to the mix was something that you couldn't find in any other group, where you had this celestial European poise and the beauty and the whole thing, and then them and the anger and the force and the grit. Those two things linked together was unique.
Soon after Nico joined the band, Andy Warhol began managing the Velvet Underground.
Andy thought, well, we have to show them off. And so he got this place. He rented it for them.
The Dom was a Polish national community center. They'd have weddings there and so forth. They had a stage, they had a balcony, and they had a dance floor. Warhol had made an arrangement to rent this place. He didn't want to call it the Dom, so he named it the Exploding Plastic Inevitable.
At the center of the experimental performance art, known as the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, were the Velvets, who played live, flanked by dancers and bathed in projections of Warhol's famous screen test films.
I would climb up on the stage, and then we would do all these dances, you know. We danced with whips. There was no choreography. There was no instruction.
I really like the idea of playing in the dark and not everybody focusing on who's doing what when. Nico would come up and you could suddenly see her, but we'd turn her back on the audience.
It was brilliant. I mean, to take $50 worth of equipment and make something show-stopping, unbelievable.
The press went crazy because Andy drew the press. And then all of a sudden you get Walter Cronkite and Jackie Kennedy coming down and dancing. Things changed rapidly.
At the end of the first week, Andy, he said, I've been thinking about making a record. You work for Columbia Records, right? I said, yeah. And he said, well, how do I? And I said, don't worry about it. I know a studio. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will see to it that the whole thing gets done in exchange for a painting.
Record exec Norman Dolph and Andy Warhol produced what was to become the Velvet Underground's first album, complete with cover art designed by Andy himself.
The tunes that they sang at the Dom are the ones that were on the Banana record.
Despite the band's cult status amongst certain circles in New York, the album was a commercial failure, at least at the time. Rolling Stone magazine would later name it the 13th greatest record of all time, one often cited by luminaries from David Bowie to the Sex Pistols to U2.
When I first discovered Velvet Underground, my mother noticed that I was playing it a lot and casually mentioned that she knew those people. She said something about how she used to dance with the band when they performed when she was a teenager. "40 years after his mother walked these same streets, heading to and fro Andy Warhol's famed factory, Beck retraces some of those steps. We wanted to do a song that was particularly New York. I'm Waiting for the Man just feels like this kind of New York street moment. To channel the band for whom his mother once danced, Beck hits one of the world's most legendary recording studios, named by and custom built for Jimi Hendrix. There's not too many places for musicians like that. Places that you can make a pilgrimage to and you can feel some history that's left. This place is a rarity. Let's try it. Okay, let's count it in. It's difficult with the Velvet Underground because their version is so definitive. If you maybe go too far off from it, you kind of lose what's special about the song. Up to Lexington, 125. Place is important in music, and the Velvet Underground are really New York. The music captures that time and something about the city.
do sort of a kind of like a sympathy for the devil. That's what I was trying to think. Sympathy for the devil. One of those like way too loud.
I'm feeling good, feeling so fine. Until tomorrow, it's just another time. I'm waiting for my man. I'm waiting for my man.
Bass. That felt great. Work out. I like that.
CBGB's was one of the places that invented punk rock. The Bowery was a very dangerous place at that time and very, very run down. People would be fighting out in the streets, and there were quite a few times you would step over dead bodies. It was really loud and nasty and dangerous, so the music was as well.
It was the most physically disgusting place I'd ever been to. Like, you'd walk into the bathroom and you're like, I didn't know that a physical space could be this disgusting.
There was a heavy, acidic urine kind of scent wafting around the venue.
Just this fucking shithole, you know. I thought, oh, okay. I mean, I didn't mind shitholes.
When I was 16 or 17 years old, my then girlfriend and I drunkenly had sex in the bathroom at CB's. Who knows what terrible things resulted from that?
Country, bluegrass, blues, and other music for uplifting gormandizers. CBGB OMFUG read the acronym on the now legendary awning that once hung out front. It stood for music that owner Hilly Crystal intended to showcase. But almost as quickly as it became known simply as CB's, the club also became synonymous with one particular genre of music that was coming from a band straight out of Queens.
I associate the Ramones with CBGB's. That's where the Ramones started.
Joey, Dee Dee, Johnny, and Tommy. In August of 1974, these four punks, the Ramones, hit CB's stage with a wild and untamed attitude.
I was working for a little record company in New York called Sire Records, and I was out scouting for new bands. And I'd seen some little flyers for a band called the Ramones, and I'd heard they were playing a club called CBGB's. I had no idea what CBGB's was. I think the first time I saw them, there must have been a dozen people at the most. They were in their very formative stage where they would be arguing and not knowing which song to start and which song ended, and just throwing their instruments down in disgust. It was not a normal rock and roll show, and it was only about 15 minutes long. They were the Beatles of Bizarro world. Everything they did was the opposite of what a rock and roll band was supposed to be, so I loved it. After seeing them play, I was just bound and determined to help them get signed. And most people in New York thought they could never even make a record because they were so chaotic. I decided to work with them and get their show into a little bit better shape to present it to my bosses to help them to get signed.
Craig Leon was a talent scout for Sire Records, a label that would later sign Madonna to her first deal. But that label's foundation was built in the 70s at CBGB's, where Craig's bosses came one night to see the Ramones, but ended up getting more than they bargained for.
The opening act that was playing for the Ramones was a three-piece band with a very, very quirky lead singer who I thought was brilliant, and a very, very tight, for CBGB's, immaculately tight rhythm section that were like one unit. And little did I know they virtually were one unit. It was a husband and wife rhythm section team. The band that I saw opening for the Ramones on that fateful night was Talking Heads. I think it was their first or second gig at CBGB's.
Sire Records would go on to sign both the Ramones and the Talking Heads. After discovering these now legendary bands in the club that would also be the launching pad for countless artists, from Patti Smith to Blondie.
CBGB was like a workshop. You know, you were able to make your mistakes in public.
The earlier gigs that Blondie did at CBGB's were quite shambolic. I kept rehearsing with them and making stuff that was demos that ended up being part of the first albums. And they were probably the most visionary of any of the bands that came out of CBGB's and the most individualistic.
Over the years, gentrification swept the Bowery. Rents skyrocketed, and Hilly Crystal simply couldn't keep up. On October 15, 2006, despite protests from die-hard fans, CBGB's closed its doors forever.
Well, when CB's closed, so many of my friends, I remember them being outraged. Well, we haven't been there in 20 years, but we're still upset that it's closing. I was like, well, that's why it's closing, because we don't go there.
A friend of mine told me that he had leased the building. And he goes, well, we're talking to like Bank of America and Dwayne Reed. And I'm like, what? CBGB's is going to become a drugstore or a bank? And he goes, yeah, well, those are the people that pay. And I'm like, no, that can't be. I can't recreate CBGB's, but how can I do something to keep it alive?
In 2008, fashion designer and avid rock fan John Varvatos purchased the building that was once home to CBGB.
I can pull back posters from every show for many years that were stuck there. That's one of the magical things here, is like when I do close my eyes, I feel like I'm back here in 1977.
They chose Ludlow Rivington, I believe, because it was close to where they lived.
In 1989, Ad Rock, MCA, and Mike D, also known as the Beastie Boys, were searching for inspiration in their own backyard.
There was nothing glamorous about it. It was, wholesale shops and bodegas. But I think the idea was that it kind of just represented New York. They still wanted to make sure that people knew they were a New York group and that New York was in their blood.
3 years after the breakout success of the group's debut, the Beasties were putting the finishing touches on their second album.
Mike D was like, we have this idea for the album cover. He said, well, it's a 360 panorama on the Lower East Side, and that's just kind of all we got. And I said, I can do that.
The Beasties were looking for an image that would forever memorialize the name of the album and draw from the surroundings of their New York City youth.
Growing up, we were all big fans of a radio show on WBLS by a New York legend named Gil Bailey, who was like the best reggae DJ in New York. And he was Jamaican, he had a wonderful voice.
Gil Bailey Show, good morning. Good morning. How you doing?
And he used to do a commercial for a store called Paul's Boutique. It was a men's clothing store somewhere out in the middle of Brooklyn. He says, come to Paul's Boutique, ask for Janice. So the idea was that we weren't going to go to Paul's Boutique, the real Paul's Boutique, because, the reality could never be as good as the fantasy. So what they did was they took an Army-Navy store and they turned it into a kind of Paul's Boutique of the mind.
On April 24th, 1989, armed with a 360-degree rotating panoramic camera, photographer and friend Jeremy Shaitan and the Beastie Boys converged on an intersection that was about to become the backdrop for one of music's most classic album covers.
I'd known these guys forever, and I called action, click the cable release. So to see them just kind of explode, because they wanted that sense of spontaneity and action. So if you look on the cover, they're all frozen in motion. The album cover kind of tied it together and made it about New York. And the way the thing folded out, it could not have been better. It was perfect.
In 1979, disco reigned supreme. And few did disco better than Chic, led by principal songwriter and producer Nile Rodgers.
We weren't the kind of band that really attracted stars. So when we saw Diana Ross standing backstage at our show, we were a little bit shocked.
Like many stars of the day, Diana Ross was looking to update her sound, to give it a disco twist. Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, the production team behind monster smashes like Chic's Le Freak and Sister Sledge's We Are Family, seemed like just the guys to help her do it.
We had a meeting, and at that meeting, we had decided that we would interview her and that her album would be a biography, that we would actually write a song about the life of Diana Ross.
Candid conversations with Diana would arm Nile with creative insight. But to find inspiration for the music, Nile hit the streets.
In New York City at the time, new clubs were opening up, and the hippest, hottest clubs were the clubs that were the most underground. The DJs were the best, they played the newest music. I wouldn't get ideas from the top 40, I'd get ideas from the underground. One night I went out to this club called the Gigi Barnum Room, and it was mainly a transvestite club. I went to the bathroom, and as I was standing at the urinal, on either side of me, there were at least 3 deep Diana Ross impersonators. Men impersonating Diana Ross. And I was like, whoa, this is just too weird. It's like I'm in a Fellini movie. The light bulb went off over my head. I'm producing Diana Ross's album. And it was like, Nile, if you don't pay attention to this, you're an idiot. They have just told me what to do without speaking a word. So I had to go outside and call my partner and say, Bernard, write this down, because I know I'm gonna get drunk tonight. I said, write down, I'm coming out. He says, I'm coming out, what do you mean? I said, dude, if we write a song called I'm Coming Out, we recognize the alliance and the love that the gay community had for Diana Ross. So when we come out with our record, we have a fan base right away. And Bernard, in his slumber, got it. What was interesting is that the words really came from Diana Ross. After we wrote, I'm coming out, Diana said basically, there's a new me coming out. It was about the new Diana Ross. She had been under the thumb of Motown her whole career, and now she's getting ready to leave. So we had an idea that she was going out on her own, but no one else did.
Among those unaware and unhappy with the new direction Diana was heading was her record label.
Motown rejected it. They thought that it wasn't a Diana Ross record. And our concept was, well, we knew her better than you knew her. It absolutely is a Diana Ross record, and it may be more of a Diana Ross record than she's ever done.
Reluctantly, Motown would release the album, simply titled Diana. It went on to become the biggest selling album of Diana Ross's career, spawning 3 international hits, including I'm Coming Out.
I say some 35 years later, if you've ever been to a Diana Ross concert, she has never walked out on stage without the band going, ladies and gentlemen, Diana Ross, I'm coming out.
Here in Central Park, are scattered the ashes of a musical icon, immortalized by a fitting one-word epitaph. The title of the song he'll be eternally remembered for.
If you think of one Lennon solo song, it's going to be Imagine. Imagine if things were different. He started playing around with this idea of how can we make the world a better place. He was writing down notes all the time, stationery, napkins, anything he could possibly find, he would be writing down notes. And he writes the song shuttling back and forth between England and New York. That Hilton Stationery lyric sheet is one of the final drafts. It contains all the lyrics that we now know as the song Imagine.
John Lennon put the finishing touches on Imagine in New York City, a city where he and his new bride Yoko Ono would make a home for themselves. At the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, at the Dakota, arguably the most famous and most infamous apartment building in the city. John Lennon would become a poster boy, quite literally, for his adopted hometown, the city that never sleeps, and yet one where John embraced the quiet.
He loved the fact that he could walk down the street and not get accosted. New York was so accustomed to celebrity life that New Yorkers would simply acknowledge him and leave him alone.
On the chilly night of April 18th, 1975, the increasingly reclusive John Lennon would make a rare appearance at Midtown Manhattan's famed Waldorf Astoria. John sings Imagine, then walks off stage and away from the spotlight. It would be the last time that John Lennon would ever perform live in public. For the next 5 years, John dedicated himself to family life and the raising of his young son, Sean.
He does go through a dry spell in that 5 years and doesn't write for a long time. But he does start to write in 1980. Yoko Ono shares a bunch of her demos. This is going to be a duet record. It's a dialogue between husband and wife.
How are you enjoying married life? It's beautiful, you know. It's beautiful.
I got a call from David Geffen's office in the summer of 1980. And he said, I want to play you something. And played me Starting Over, not telling me who it was. So I'm hearing this song, well, wow, it's really cool. Who is it? David told me this is John Lennon, and he's got a new album that's going to be out later in the year. David invited me to do an interview as the only radio interview that he would be granting.
On December 8th, 1980, 3 weeks after the release of Double Fantasy, Dave Sholin, a San Francisco-based DJ, heads to New York City to conduct an exclusive interview with John Lennon and Yoko Ono at the Dakota.
We began with Yoko, and John enters and puts his arms out like, hey folks, I'm here. Just watching them over the course of this interview, they would take some glances at each other. You could feel the magnetism, how much these two people cared for each other. It was something you don't really see too often.
Dave spent the next 3 hours interviewing the happy couple about their lives and their art.
We were talking about starting over, but he goes, I just turned 40. I feel like this was a rebirth, and just as the title says, starting over. Late in the afternoon when we were wrapping up, we go downstairs, we've packed up everything, and the next thing we know, John steps out in front of the Dakota, kind of like joked, hey, where are my fans? You know, there were like a few people across the street. Someone came over. He had a copy of Double Fantasy. He got an autograph from John. John and Yoko had no car, so we were happy to give them a lift over to the studio.
John and Yoko were headed to the Record Plant recording studios, where they were continuing to work on music together.
In the car, on the ride over, we had such a great conversation. This was off the record, nothing being recorded. He was singing a little bit of Little Richard, Tutti Frutti, and Jerry Lee Lewis got a Great Balls of Fire. And I'm getting my private concert with John Lennon singing rock and roll songs to me. I'm thinking, this is incredible. We even talked briefly about his relationship with Paul. He said we had our differences, but the bottom line is we're like brothers, and I love him.
Dave Sholin says goodbye to John and Yoko outside the Record Plant and heads to the airport to catch his flight back to San Francisco. The couple would spend the next several hours working together before returning home.
They're in the recording session till 6 or 7 at night. They leave the recording studio and they're dropped off at the Dakota. And within a few minutes after stepping out of the car, the same young man who has gotten his autograph on that copy of Double Fantasy a few hours earlier pulls out a pistol and unloads 5 rounds into John Lennon's back.
I was 1 block away, and we saw these people making this mad dash towards 72nd Street. We didn't know what had gone on. We walked outside, and we said, what's happening? Where's everybody going? They said, John Lennon was just shot. We're like completely blown away.
I was in my car, leaving the airport, turned the radio on, and heard the horrific news that John Lennon had been shot and killed in New York. My proximity to someone that committed this horrific act, I get chills. It brings back some very, very difficult emotions.
They came with flowers and candles, posters and signs for a final tribute to John Lennon and his music.
Very quickly, overnight, crowds assemble around the Dakota and spill into Central Park. Crowds gather at parks worldwide, in London, in Liverpool, in New York.
As horrible as that day ended, at least we had something that we could share with the world and let people know love and peace is not something that's just a phrase. It can happen.
And the world would be as one, in shock and mourning, left now and forever, only to imagine what might have been. Music happens when and where you least expect it. It's all around you. You just need to know where to look.